People who grew up in neighborhoods controlled by the mafia. Egg. New York in the 60s to 80s. How was your real daily life influenced? The stuff in New York in the 70s and 80s was not really like a huge mafia war zone. It was more like a lot of financial rackets, corrupt unions, and various schemes. Thuggy street drug gangs were far more dangerous to the average person. So no different from now. There really was a serious crime wave in the 70s and 80s. If you're not old enough, ask someone who lived through it about missing kids on milk cartons. Murder rates just in New York jumped from 4 to 30 per 100,000 people. Leaded gasoline, man. Leaded gasoline. Amazing what happens when IQ levels rise. Not just IQ. Interferes with impulse control, related to intelligence, but not necessarily the same thing. IQ is a nice handy way of saying it. I have friends who grew up in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. One of them told me as he was growing up there, he would see guys walking around wearing suits, kissing each other on their cheeks, doing the whole Godfather thing. They also bought up all the properties in the neighborhood, making it impossible for non-Italians to buy real estate, but they let my friend's family do it because they wanted to open a Chinese restaurant and the Italians wanted to be able to go out for Chinese. There were Genovese drug stores everywhere too, that is owned by the Genovese crime family, and my friends would shop there. The mafia is a lot less active there now though. I hike most of them have moved to New Jersey. A guy I worked with grew up in NJ in the late 70s. He would say never disrespect an old Italian man in a nice suit, you never know. I moved to Philly about a year ago, and the neighborhood I live in used to be mob territory. Apparently it was actually a lot nicer back then than it is now. No crime, streets were clean. Nobody dared do anything on mob turf without their consent. First, they kept all the illegal dealings outside of where they lived. My mom knew someone who lived in a Hells Angels neighborhood. One day a ton of stuff was stolen from her house. They pulled up a truck and took anything of value. Cops said they'd keep an eye out, but not much hope. 2 days later, the Angels dropped everything off with an apology. I remember reading a similar story about a reporter in Japan getting mugged. He was doing a story on the accuser, and just happened circumstance he ends up getting mugged, and his wallet/passport was stolen. The police were basically no help, but told him an address to go to. When he went there, it was a local Yakuza lieutenant. He told them what happened, and 24 hours later his wallet, passport, and money were all returned to him. Overall it was pretty good. The neighborhood was always clean and taken care of. New York City sanitation snowplows would clear the streets constantly during a snowstorm. The sanitation workers would manually shovel the sidewalks of our block. Meanwhile, the news is reporting people being snowed in, and city plows are not showing up. It wasn't until I got older that this wasn't the norm. Also, guys in bespoke suits hanging out during traditional working hours wasn't a norm as well. My parents would tell me not to go into certain stores or walk on certain streets. At the time I didn't fully grasp the reasoning behind the rules. I thought the guys in bespoke suits were nice, since they always would gather kids and family around a Mr. Softy ice cream truck for free desserts during summer evenings. I never saw any beatings or hits. I heard a lot of get out here kid, be smart, stay in school, and drugs are for weak-minded people. I guess you can say it's more like a Bronx Tale than it was Godfather or Casino. I grew up in the neighborhood where Carlo Gambino had a house and later where John Gotti Jr. lived. It was similar to this. Nothing happened in our neighborhood. They did their thing in the city/away from where they lived. It was hilarious how none of the mafia guys ever answered their door on Halloween. We learned to not waste our time going to their houses. John Jr. loved July 4th though. He used to give fireworks to all the kids. The parents in our neighborhood hated it, but they weren't going to say anything to him. A neighbor ran over and killed one of Gotti's kids on accident. It was actually the kid's fault. The guy apologized, and Gotti said he understood it was an accident, but then the guy disappeared. Don't worry, we all understand the guy just had another accident. I grew up in New York, on the other side of the Hudson from the city, and while the presence wasn't like what I imagine it is in the city, it was there. Where we lived, it was a lot of houses that were decently spaced from each other, in the foothills of the Catskills, with a lot of people I called uncle or cousin, that came around maybe once every week or two, and were amazingly cool to me. They all ate and drank at my aunt's restaurant when they were there. They always had change for me for the jukebox to go buy a record or mad or cracked or whatever. When I made my first communion, it was a haul. I didn't get it then, but they laid out some bucks buying me all kinds of gold crosses, rings, necklaces with medallions of my patron saint, etc. Every Christmas or birthday was like that. No one broke into houses in our neighborhood, even though there was a problem with that in the general area. Snowplows always hit our streets right away. Even when there was a strike, our garbage got picked up. When my mom was in the hospital with cancer and my dad was visiting her as much as possible, somehow our lawn was always done. Meals were delivered to the house daily. Laundry was done. I was always looked after by someone. We moved when I was 9, 1979, but years later before my grandma died, she had one of those honest talks with me and laid out how both my mother and father's side of the family were back to 1920s and that my dad was basically legit because his father demanded that. But that said, as an accountant, he still cooked the books for a lot of illegitimate businesses. I also found out then the reason my dad moved us down south then was that I was getting to an age I would soon put things together, and he didn't want that. Last I ever saw of any of those people from New York was when my dad passed and two guys not much older than me showed up and gave me an envelope with about $12K in it to help with funeral expenses. I said it was covered by insurance, and the one I remember being named Tommy said then keep the scoots for yourself. Did you keep the scoots for yourself? I absolutely did. I was only 20 and that kind of money back then really made a difference in my life. Do you have any remorse about that now knowing that legitimate businesses suffered, so you could have that money, and people very likely were injured, or even killed by the people that helped you? Grew up in Brooklyn in the late 60s early 70s, but moved away when I was 9. Only thing I really remember is a guy on our block named Teddy who even then I could tell was some kind of low-level gangster. Drove a Corvette Stingray, and when it got stolen one day had a new one in a different color the next day. He also had a dog, a huge terrifyingly fierce German Shepherd that he had either found or raised, but all I know is everyone crossed to the other side of the street when that dog was out front of his brownstone, even though there was a metal fence and it was chained. But the main thing with Teddy was that every July 4th he would completely fill the trunk of his Corvette with firecrackers of all kinds. He used to stand there and let the Ladifinas go off in his hand, which was scary, but not crazy, and he'd light the normal firecrackers that you definitely didn't want going off in your hand, and he'd hold them for 3 or 4 or 5 seconds and then toss it away with a laugh just as it exploded. He'd do the same thing with cherry bombs that could blow your fingers off. We were amazed, but then eventually he'd bring out the heavy artillery, something that was called a blockbuster that was supposedly equal to half stick of dynamite. When he lit that thing even he ran away, and you can be sure that if Teddy was running everyone else was running too. The thing left cracks all along the street. Then everyone went over to the schoolyard where he was going to light off a battery that was supposed to be more like 1 full stick or dynamite or 2, but I was too young, and, quite smartly, my parents sent me to bed. So I never saw that. Overall I'm sure he was a thug of some kind and we all were scared of him, but also loved the crazy energy he brought to the block. I've got a weird mixed image in my head of a 1940s style mobster in a dapper suit standing next to a 70s Corvette. Lol. Yeah, I would buy fireworks off a guy in Little Italy, then run them across Canal Street and sell them to preppies from NJ for a 3-5x profit. My other memory of that kind of thing was going down to Hicks Street by the expressway, which was lined with boarded up buildings. A guy was standing out front of one, and he'd lift the plywood on a door, and we'd climb up a stairway to a room with a single dim bulb hanging from the ceiling and 4 to 5 guys surrounded by a mountain of boxes of firecrackers. Me and my friends were like 8 years old and we'd buy packs for 10 cents each with change we'd scrounged from our parents. It was normal, but also sort of cool and exciting. We collected so many packs of firecrackers the whole street went nuts on July 4th. That was Cobble Hill in like 1970, a very different place from now. My mother was a bartender at a restaurant/bar in Boston. Sometimes she would bring me in the late afternoons for a Shirley Temple. I would sit with the men in dapper suits. They were wonderful to me and loved my mother. They nicknamed her Sunny. They were always genuinely interested in what was going on in my life, school, friends, activities, etc. I loved to visit with them and was enamored by their kindness towards my mother. I had never seen such strong men in my life at the time and wished one of them would be my father. I wasn't aware of their goings on until I was around 12 years old. I was a night owl and would eavesdrop on conversations. Her only true confidant was her sister, who worked at the same place. I heard her say that they had offered to kill my father, who had left her when I was a baby, but would come over every couple weeks and beat everyone up. She was crying and said she begged them not to hurt him, but they told her they were going to break his knees. My mother killed herself some years later. A time went by. My father had an accident. Both his legs below the knees were shattered and he had to retire from the police force. I've always wondered. Wasn't expecting a real answer to this question. A girl I dated in HS. Her family owned several Greek restaurants. Money laundering. When she was about to turn 18, her dad asked to speak to me and let me know it was time to stop seeing his DAUGHTER*. He had always been really nice before then, and I was a cocky dude back then, but you could tell by his tone, demeanor, etc. that it was in my best interest to listen. *WAS time to get ready for her arranged marriage. Look. This is one of those conversations where I talk and you shut up. In the military, we've always called those one-way conversations. Yeah, but in the end you get to reply with your branch nonsense bullshit like ooh or rah, or whatever your branch used with the fuck you tone. The mob ran Youngstown, Ohio for decades. When I was growing up in the 90s is when they started to really getting torn apart. The power vacuum is what is really the weird part. These illegal businesses don't just go away because the ones running it get taken down. So there was a lot of gang violence when I was young as rivals tried to capitalize the drug, gun, and gambling markets. It kinda just became corruption at one point. Public officials/workers getting indicted left and right. Our congressman, Jim Traficant, was embroiled in bribery scandals for the 8th time, only slightly exaggerated. That's when the FBI showed up at my house looking for my dad. He was in Florida and my mom told them to come back with a warrant. I knew we were always around some shady shit. That was the confirmation. I was 13. 2 of his friends went to jail, 2 more indicted, and 1 received immunity to flip. Damn, I grew up in Youngstown in the early 2000s, and I never really understood why my parents never really took us downtown ever. All I wanted was to see a Phantoms hockey game as a kid, and never got to do it. My younger brothers live in Boardman now, which isn't too far from Youngstown, and every time I go back there, I realize just how shitty that place was. While I was growing up, I was 8 when the failed assassination of the county prosecutor happened in '96. That was really the one where I really started to comprehend what Youngstown was. I had heard stories of Youngstown tune-ups, car bombs, and my parents would point out houses in our neighborhood that was bombed or shot up. My dad would tell me about the crazy shit the mob used to pull. And here they just tried to off the DA. Used to. They were doing that shit in real time. Geez. My parents never really told me how dangerous that place really was. All they said was that it's unsafe. I moved away when I was about 11, and I knew it was a really dangerous. That place was when I was a little bit older, but it wasn't really until now that I'm learning all of this stuff.